Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today's video is going to be about table saws and the basics of how to use one. If you only have a small amount of space in your shop like I do, then you may be limited on what the basic power tools are that you can have. Now, arguably a table saw is probably one of the most versatile tools that you can have, provided that you know a few tricks as to how to use one. Today we're going to cover blade types, safety, basic usage and how to do some basic cut, cross-cutting and ripping as well. And I'll also talk a little bit about some of the accessories that you can make which will really open up some possibilities. The first thing to know is that there are a couple of different types of table saw that you can buy. There's this type, which is known as a sight saw, and it's collapsible, has wheels, and it can be easily moved around. They're not as stable as the larger type saws, and also the tops or the bed that they have are generally made out of aluminium or steel rather than the nicer cast iron ones. Some of you may be asking, why not just use a mitre saw for all of this stuff? And you can, but a mitre saw is quite limited on what it can do. It's very good for cross-cutting big long lengths of timber. You can't obviously rip timber on it because you haven't got the length. And the nice thing about a table saw is if you know what you're doing, you can actually use it for both. You can even use it for mitre cuts as well, if you've got the right accessories for it, which generally come with the saw, or you can even make your own. Let's talk a little bit about blade types. Table saws, as I said, have two main functions. You either cross-cut or you rip cut. A cross-cut is literally where you cut across the grain, and a rip cut is where you cut along the grain. These two different types of cut generally require two different types of blade. The higher the tooth count on the blade, the worse job it's going to do at ripping along the piece of wood. This is because the gap between the teeth, as you can see here, is not very wide. So as it removes material along through here, which is generally the soft fibres going in that are lined up in a row, the blade has a limited ability to get rid of the waste between the teeth. That's why you need a blade like this one, which has got a much wider gap between the teeth. You can see here actually the teeth are spaced from here to here. This piece is not actually a tooth. This is for helping get rid of the waste on the way through the cut. So this is a ripping blade and this is a cross-cut blade. You can get blades which are general purpose blades. The trouble with that is that they're not brilliant at doing either, but they will do both. So you have to make a choice. Now, on the basis that it's quite easy to switch blades out, I think it's worth getting a blade for the right purpose. If you're cutting plywood and you use a wide tooth blade like this one, it will make an absolute mess of the edge of the wood. You can see here there's just a little bit of chip out, which is what I cut with this blade. If you cut this with a fine tooth blade, you'll get a much nicer cut. Plywood's obviously different because you have grain running in both directions. So you have grain running this way and then the layer underneath runs this way. So this blade is an 80 tooth blade. You can see it says 80 teeth on there. This blade, which is the ripping blade, is a 24 tooth blade. And this one is a 40 tooth blade. So that's the way to tell when you're buying the blades as to what it's going to do. The more teeth it has, the less able it's going to be to cut along the grain of wood, but the more able it's going to be to cut composite materials such as plywood, where you've got multiple layers together, and also things like metals and plastics. Whenever you're using these, you always need to wear some kind of eye protection. When you buy the table saw, you generally will get a cover that will go over the blade, but you'll see pretty much everybody, especially if you watch a lot of YouTube videos like I do, nearly everybody takes them off. Now, they take them off because they get in the way generally of deeper cuts. If you remove the safety cover, you're going to have chips flying up towards your face. So you must wear some eye protection. Either a pair of safety glasses like these, or if you wear glasses like I do, use those. Cutting wood on a table saw is an incredibly dusty business. Dust collection on table saws is absolutely terrible. They're not really configured in a way where you can collect much dust. I've adapted this one as best as I can to try and suck as much dust out of the bottom, but it still isn't going to do a tremendously good job. With the blade spinning in this direction, bits will kick up this way, as will the fine particles of dust. So if you're cutting a lot of material, then you definitely need to be wearing some sort of respirator, particularly if you're cutting horrible stuff like plywood, which has got a lot of glue in it. You need to be very, very careful as to what you're breathing in. Another thing you need to be careful of is obviously keeping your hands away from the piece of work that you're cutting. Now, there are various different push sticks available that this one I use for holding on to wider boards going through the blade, which has a foam back on it, and that is actually just a sanding pad that I bought from a big box store for less than a couple of pounds. I'm going to come on to push sticks and things a little bit more when we start making some actual cuts. The other main safety feature that you'll see on these table saws is this thing here. That is called a riving knife or a splitter. Now, the idea with that, as you have your wood going through the blade like this being cut, the knife at the back stops the ends coming in that way and hitting the back of the blade, which is going this way. Now, obviously, you can imagine what will happen if the wood touches the blade at the back, which is spinning towards you. It would kick the wood up like that and would hit you probably quite nicely in the face. Never ever take these off. They are adjustable to make sure that you've got it level with the top of the blade or just below the top of the blade, but don't remove them. So you've got your saw all set up and you're ready to make a cut. Let's make a 5cm cut. So I'm lining up on the tape measure. I'm going to flick the fence because then I know it's straight, and then lock it down. Now the best thing to do is to make sure that you've only got as much blade out as you need. So I'm going to lower this down to be just above the height of the wood. I'm going to get my push stick and I'm going to get my other push block. And the first thing I'm going to do before I turn the saw on is to make sure that I'm not obstructed when I come off the end of the table saw. Now, I'm not wearing a respirator because obviously I need to talk to you and you wouldn't be able to hear me through all the muffled beard noises. So I have my glasses on, I've tested my throughput and I'm going to line it up there ready to go. Now make sure that it's behind the blade before you start. Sounds stupid, but you'd be amazed as to what can happen by accident. And then turn it on. Now when I push the wood through, I'm going to do a slow, smooth push. I don't want to go too fast. Don't be worried about pausing if you've never done this before. The blade will just be cutting air. It's not really going to hurt it. And the other thing to make sure is that you make sure that the wood here is being pushed this way gently onto the fence. It's very easy to push the wood through slightly away from the fence like that, particularly if you're pushing from this end, and then you'll either get a wedge out the other side or you'll pinch the piece of wood in the blade, between the blade and the fence on the way through, and that's a very good way of getting a kickback. The other thing that I would suggest is that you stand this side of the wood. As you finish the cut, it's entirely possible for the thing to fly backwards behind at great speed. So let's make this cut. Keep holding the wood as the blade stops. It will kick it back if you're not careful. I've put holes in walls behind me doing this before where the piece of wood has just shot back. And there you go, it's a nice, reasonably clean cut. I put the ripping blade in for this so you can see that it's not a bad finish. So that was the simple ripping cut. Now you can also cut dados doing it like this, and it's not as difficult as you might think. Now in the UK we're not allowed a dado stack, which is a set of blades that is a particular width, which you can just run a piece of wood through and then it will cut you a nice channel down the side. They don't consider us to be sensible enough, I don't think, to have them, which is probably a fair shout in most cases. Let's say you wanted to cut a dado to fit this piece of wood in this piece of wood, like that, so you have an overlap. What we need to do is to cut a slot in this piece of wood that is the right height to take this piece of wood and then whatever depth we need. So the first thing we need to do is to set the depth of the blade to the thickness of the piece of wood that we want to fit in. So you can adjust your blade. So the top tooth, you can see it's just visible, and I'm going to move it just below to there. And then you need to know how wide you want the dado to be. Now let's just say we want the same width as the height, because that's quite common. Now we obviously have to take into account the thickness of the blade. So you can line it up like that, bring it over and then lock it off. So now when we push the wood through, we'll have a slot cut in here, which is the first half of the piece. Let's make that cut now. So I'm standing this side again. There's no likelihood of anything flying back this time because we're not cutting all the way through the wood. Also, you don't have to worry too much about the blade coming out through the top because obviously you're only coming up through there. But it's a good habit not to take that for granted. If you start doing this and pushing your wood through, one day you're going to make a mistake and you're not going to have any fingers left. So use one of these or a piece of wood that you've made or another push stick. So check the wood is out of the way of the blade, turn on the saw, push through slowly and gently, it's not a race, let the blade do the work. If you hear the motor straining, slow down. And there we go. We have a slot. Now we need to do the other part of the slot, which if I'm measured right, it should be set up in the right place, shouldn't it? So let's give that a try as well. Remember, slow, steady wins the race. Now there's a good example. Now it didn't fly out, but it could have done. So this piece of wood was on its way. So that's a good example. It's actually quite a nice little offcut. Now if you're like me, you'll end up with hundreds and thousands of pieces of wood like this because it's just too nice to throw away, isn't it? Anyway, there you go. So you have a nice dado cut in your piece of wood, which, let's see. Oh look, it fits absolutely perfectly. Which absolutely wouldn't have happened in real life. And it literally is the first time I've recorded this, so there's not many cuts done, pardon the pun. So there you go, that's how to cut a dado, or one way of cutting a dado in a piece of wood. So the other thing we want to do is to make a cross cut. Now, most table saws come with these things. They are a mitre attachment and they run in the rail. Now this isn't the one that came with this saw, so it's a little bit too deep, but it'll do for the purposes of the video. They have generally a auxiliary fence that goes along here, and a variable angle so you can set a mitre if you want to. Because these are variable, they have a habit of moving, so I tend to make sure when I line them up to never take it for granted that it's straight against the blade. Later on I'm going to show you a crosscut sled and how that can transform your whole life with these table saws, so it's worth sticking around for that. So to make these cuts, again, we're going to set the blade depth to the right height. We're going to cut all the way through this time, and we're going to come along here and we're just going to move straight forward, holding onto the fence and moving that way. Now, I know that this is not the right depth because this is too thick, so I've got a slight angle on here, but you kind of get the idea. Again, stand this side, so anything that tends to move on this part of the table saw doesn't hit you in the leg or any other very sensitive areas. It's worth noting just quickly that nearly all accidents that happen on the table saw happen when the blade is slowing down. People reaching in to move the wood out of the way because they're impatient and they forget the blade, or they make a mistake, or the cat trips them over, or something along those lines, or your wife comes through the door, makes you jump, suddenly you have no opposable thumb, which kind of ruins your day quite badly. So always let the blade stop. It takes a few seconds, that's all. The better the saw, actually, the faster the blade will stop because they tend to have a blade break in them. So there you go. So there's a cross cut. You can also make a dado cut on these. We're going to do the same thing again on this piece of wood. We have our depth set, which I'm going to move down slightly. It's a bit high. All we need to do now is pass the saw through and make that cut. So this brings us into the second way of making a dado. Now, we haven't really got an ability to flip the wood this way up this time. So what we can do is just use the kerf of the blade and make the cut gradually, piece by piece, taking multiple passes to get what you want. There you go, so you have a perfectly passable dado cut there. Sometimes you'll get ridges left in there which you can just clean up with some sandpaper or some chisel, and then again you have another dado cut. So that was cross-cutting. Now, one thing you might be wondering is why I'm not using the rather lovely coloured stock throat plate that came with the saw. This is what's known as a zero clearance plate, which obviously I made, as you can tell. And the idea is that in order to get a nice clean cut with as little tear out as possible, when you cut the wood, you need the fibres to be supported as close to the blade edge as possible. Now, as you can see from this one, which is the stock throat plate, it's designed with a wider than what this actually is, and I generally always use it unless I'm making an angled cut. Now, obviously that means that you've got a lot of unsupported fibres going down through the blade edge, which means that you've got a much greater chance of it tearing out as the blade passes down through it. These table saws tend to be equipped with a variable blade angle. And you can see this if we move this up. And you can release, and then you can angle the blade like that. So if you want to make a 45-degree cut, it's a simple matter of making sure the blade is all the way up, getting a speed square or something like a speed square, and then lining it up on the blade, like that. And most of these saws have a gauge on the side which is supposedly going to tell you the angle, but I don't rely on them. So let's see about trying to put a 45-degree chamfer on the side of this piece of wood. The first thing we need to do is set the height of the blade again. We don't want it going through any further than is necessary. So we're going to use the wood same as we did before, just to make sure that we're only just coming through the top, and that will show you roughly where you're going to be. So when you're making the angle cut, it's quite hard to actually tell where to put the fence in order to make sure that you get all of the angle. So what I tend to do is to use a ruler or some sort of straight edge against the back of the blade, which I've already set to the right depth, and then it should give me a pretty good idea as to roughly where my fence has got to go. So cutting is exactly the same as before. "45-degree cut. Oh, I've got angle blindness. There, you can see it's pretty good. So this goes on to my other point, in that who needs a mitre saw, really? When you're setting your blade back vertically, always check it with the blade fully out, not like I just did. So one really useful thing about table saws are these channels in the bed, which you can make sleds for to fit in. You can see this one here, which I made some time ago. This is a mitre sled that I made for cutting 90-degree angles. This is a perfect 90-degree. So there we go. That is a perfect 90-degree angle. So long as you cut both sides of the angle on both sides of the sled, you know you're going to be bang on. Now this is what's known as a cross-cut sled, and it is probably the best thing that you can possibly have for your table saw. I need to remake this one, as you can clearly see, because it's literally falling apart in the middle. And when I do, I'll make a video on this, because it is an insanely useful piece of equipment. It really replaces one of these entirely for doing 90-degree crosscuts. and it's much, much safer, and I'll show you why. Now, as you can see, that's a nice cross cut. This is pretty rubbishy old wood, so it's a bit scrappy, but it gives you the idea. The nice thing about this is that this fence is 90 degrees and it's calibrated as well, which means that you can guarantee very, very quickly that you're getting perfect angles. And because you can hold this like this and away from the blade, it's a lot safer than cutting it against a fence or against the rail slider that you have over there. The thing about these sleds that you need to remember is that a very, very basic one like this, which is literally just a 90-degree fence and a slot, is pretty much all you need for just about everything. You'll see videos online where these are incredibly complicated. People have put rails across the top and flip blocks along here, which you can then tighten down and use it as a stop block. They're absolutely brilliant, and I will probably put some of those features in mine. But to start off with, just make something simple. It's literally 3 pieces of wood glued together. That's it. Well, screwed together in this case. As far as accuracy is concerned, get it as good as you can. It's going to be pretty okay for most things. It depends on what you're making. If you're going into massively fine woodworking, then you might need it to be a thousandth of a millimetre accurate. For most of us normal people, that isn't necessary. The last thing I will say about these table saw tools is that the moment that you're not scared of them anymore, walk away from them. They are incredibly dangerous, but using the right common sense and proper techniques, they can be an incredibly useful addition to your shop, whether you're woodworking in a shed or whether you have a huge area to work in, which clearly I do not. Thank you ever so much for watching this video and getting to the end. I hope it's given you some good information and some good tips as to how to be safe with these things. If you found value in this video, please hit the like button down there. Subscribe if you haven't. I'm doing a video a week and we cover all sorts of things from basic woodworking to wood turning and all sorts of things that I've got planned coming up. Some very exciting things. So thank you once again. Please leave me a comment. Let me know how you thought the video was. If you have any questions, please put them in there and I will try and answer them as best as I can. So until next time, bye-bye.